Welcome to Earth Chapters, brought to you by Pollinator Friendly Alliance. You can find us at pollinatorfriendly.org. Pollinator Friendly Alliance is a grassroots nonprofit powered by the enthusiasm of our partners and volunteers to protect the natural world, pollinators, and their habitats. Remember, everything in the natural world is connected. An ecosystem is a community of living things that work together and rely upon the other. Let's be good stewards of the ecosystem. Earth Chapter 3 is Monarch Conservation with Katie-Lyn Bunney from Monarch Joint Venture, and our second talk, Groundwater Conservation with Lauren Haydon-Dries from Washington Conservation District. So let's get started.
My name is Katie-Lyn Bunney. I am the education coordinator for the Monarch Joint Venture, which is a national conservation organization based in St. Paul, Minnesota. We have over 90 partners across the US, all working towards the monarch conservation goals that we've collectively decided. So for those of you who are not familiar, just a quick review of basic biology of Lepidoptera. The monarch butterfly goes through 4 life stages: egg, larva, pupa, and adult. But the unique thing about monarchs is that they only have one host plant, and that host is milkweed. And there are about 12 or 13 different species of milkweed native to Minnesota and over 100 native to North America. But milkweed is the only plant that monarch caterpillars recognize as food. Their eggs are extremely small. They're only about the size of a pinhead, and they have this unique shape to them. It's kind of a football shape that's flat on the end, and then it's got those unique ridges that run laterally from the tip to the base of the leaf there. So if you see something that's kind of a yellowish color on a milkweed plant, check for those ridges. Sometimes the milkweed will fool you and make you think that a sap bubble is a milkweed or a monarch egg. So take a close look for those ridges if you're looking for monarch eggs outside this summer. Over 2 weeks, monarchs grow about 2,000 times their original size, from the size of their egg to the size of the larger caterpillar there, the 5th instar. And that would be like a human infant growing to the size of an elephant in just 2 weeks. So that's a pretty remarkable change for an insect. And then at the end of those 2 weeks, they form their J and then pupate into that jade green chrysalis that's so familiar to monarch butterflies. And then it's another 2 weeks or so before that monarch will be an adult. And monarch adults the males and females do look different. So the male that you see on the screen there is on the right, the female is on the left. And if you could see my cursor here, I'm circling the identifying feature of the male monarch, these little black dots here on their hind wings. Those are called androconial patches, and that's how you can tell the difference between an adult male and female monarch. Here we go. So I mentioned I'm going through a lot of this basic stuff because monarchs have a very complex life history. It's not a simple thing. They go through quite a few changes throughout the year, which can make conservation of monarchs a little bit challenging. So in the fall, every monarch that's in the North American region will migrate somewhere. So monarchs that are west of the Rockies over here will migrate to the coast of California. But most of what I'm focusing on today is the eastern population, and that's what we see here in Minnesota in the summer. And they will start migrating sometime in August, usually the middle of August. And then by the 1st of November, the first week of November, they have reached their overwintering sites in Mexico, and they spend the winter there. They're in what's called reproductive diapause, which means they're not sexually active, they're not sexually mature yet. So they can survive the whole winter just like that. They don't eat anything, they don't drink anything, and they just kind of hang out waiting for the weather to change in the spring. And along that migration, they will roost in trees, sunflower fields, anywhere that's sheltered in these large groups, whereas normally we would normally see one monarch at a time. Journey North is a really fantastic website that you could log on right now if you wanted to watch the migration. They put out weekly migration updates as well. And this is an older map, but I still use it because I like showing the animation of how the migration is moving south. Each one of those dots represents an individual monarch that, or an individual roost that somebody spotted along the migration route. So some cues that monarchs are receiving for migration involve temperature. In the fall, they're receiving still pretty relatively warm days, but cooler nights. The angle of the sun is changing, but the milkweed is also aging. It's senescing, it's going to seed, it's turning yellow, and that all of those things combined trigger monarchs to migrate south. They overwinter in Mexico or California, depending on where they're at, for up to 9 months, from November to March or April. Or they live 9 months, I should say. They overwinter for about 5 or 6 of those. And then at the end of that 5 months, they start migrating north again. These are just a few pictures of what those overwintering sites look like in Mexico. I can cycle back through a couple so you can see them. This particular one is in California. They overwinter on eucalyptus trees. In Mexico, they overwinter on OML fir trees. And then on sunny days, they'll fly around looking for nectar and water to drink, but they can't fly unless their wings are about, their flight muscles are about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. So then when the weather changes in the spring, usually the beginning of March, they'll start being more active, they'll start dispersing and then fly north again. So they will reach about Texas area, they'll get to Texas, Louisiana, other southern states and lay their eggs along the way. And then those adults that spent the winter in Mexico die. They've fulfilled their life's purpose. They've passed on their genes to their offspring. But then those offspring that are hatching in April, when they are adults, they will continue the migration north into the Corn Belt region, into the northern part of the US and the southern reaches of Canada. And we see monarchs here in Minnesota from usually the first week of June, sometimes the middle of May to the end of August or early September. You can also watch the migration moving north again in the spring. This is similar to what you would see on Journey North right now, but again, this is an older animated map. You can find some more updated data on their website. So to estimate the monarch population, and this is how we get more information on the monarch butterfly in general so that we can make the best decisions for them. And to do that, the baseline data that we need is how big the population is in the winter. And monarchs are very convenient in that they all go to the same place at the same time every year. So we can count them all together. There are not very many organisms that we can do that with. Now, the photo that you're seeing here, a lot of people might look at this and think all those trees are dead, but they're orange because they are covered in monarch butterflies. This picture was taken by Lincoln Brower in the 1980s, so we don't see images like this anymore, but I show it because you can get a good visual of how difficult it can be to count the monarchs. And so what scientists do is they will go around and geotag around all of the, I'm pointing at the screen like you can all see where my finger is, I'm sorry. I'll use my cursor. So they go around to these edges of the forest here and geotag where all of the trees have monarchs, and then they calculate the area that the monarchs take up. And that is how we get graphs like this. So the monarch overwintering numbers for Mexico were just released a couple of weeks ago, and the numbers this year are at 2.83 hectares. And that's a measure of area. And you'll notice that it's down about 53% from last year, which is unfortunate, but not wholly unexpected. Dr. Chip Taylor at Monarch Watch puts out a kind of a State of the Monarchs blog every summer, and he estimated that he predicted that we would see a smaller number this year because they were quick to migrate north. Things warmed up very quickly here in the US, so monarchs moved up faster than they probably should have. When they can stay in Texas and Oklahoma, they have more time to mature, they have more time to find the food that they need and then be stronger for continuing the migration north. And then in the West, things are a little bit different because there are fewer monarchs. They can estimate them by number. So you'll notice the y-axis over here is by number. But the Western monarchs are really, they really need our help. So if you know anybody in the West, they're currently, the Xerces Society for the Conservation of Invertebrates is currently doing a, in conjunction with Washington State University, it's called Western Monarch Mystery Mapper. And it's a push to get people outside looking for monarchs so that, and milkweed, so that we can know where monarchs and milkweed are this time of year. But there were only, the last couple of years, there were only about 30,000 monarchs in California overwintering, which is significantly lower than past years. And the reason for this decline is habitat loss. We're losing milkweed habitat, we're still losing pollinator habitat in general. And you know, the big push in recent years for monarchs has been to plant more milkweed, but they also need more nectar sources. They need to be able to have nectar for the adults as well to fuel the breeding in the summer. This is the biggest driver for the population decline, but there are other contributing factors, including the use of pesticides and especially climate change and how that's shifting conditions in Mexico and milkweed, the optimal milkweed habitat here in the United States. There are people working on this. Monarch Joint Venture, like I said, is a partnership of over 90 organizations. These are most of them. I might be missing a few logos on this slide, but there are several Minnesota-based organizations, including the DNR, Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, Minnesota Native Landscapes, Duluth Monarch Buddies, just to name a few. So we have lots and lots and lots of people who are all working towards conserving the monarch migration. And you can report things that you are doing yourself to our Monarch Conservation Efforts map. And that's on our website if you're looking to find an effort near you or want to report something that you're doing. So you're probably all wondering what you can do to help. There are lots and lots of things that you can do to help, and we use monarchs as a flagship species. So we know that people love monarchs, and we know that by helping monarchs, they can also be helping other pollinators, native bees and other butterflies. So to learn more specifically about monarchs is the first thing that you can do, and you can do that at the Monarch Joint Venture website. We have over a dozen handouts that you can print off for yourself or read there right on our website. We've got different pages on our website that you can peruse. And we also have our own monthly monarch conservation habitat series that we do in partnership with the National Conservation and Training Center with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they are all archived on our website. And you can also register for the next ones coming up on our website as well. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram if you want to follow our social media accounts. We post some fun facts on there occasionally. The next thing you can do to help monarchs is plant things, specifically milkweed. These are a few common species or I shouldn't say super common, not all of them are very common, but you'll see in the center on the top here is common milkweed. This is by far the most common milkweed plant in the United States. That's why it's called common milkweed. Some other fun ones are swamp milkweed, world milkweed over here on the right. Butterfly weed is a good one for gardens because it's short and it doesn't spread. Poke milkweed over on the bottom right is another great one for gardens that have more shade. That's a shade-loving milkweed plant. And then there's Sullivan's milkweed, which is a less common species, but still very, very beautiful. They also need nectar plants. So with nectar plants, it's important to have a continuous bloom, something blooming for monarchs from the time they return back to Minnesota in the spring through the summer and into the fall. And milkweed can be a part of that. You'll see there's a little bee on that, well, there's two bees. There's a honeybee over here and then a bumblebee over here on the left. I didn't notice that. So having something blooming in all parts of the season. You've probably heard this before, but Liatris, blazing star, is a fantastic pollinator plant. Monarchs love it, bees love it, hummingbirds love it. And then New England aster for Minnesota is another great one because it blooms late into the fall. You can also contribute to monitoring programs. There are 4 big ones that you can participate in Minnesota. One is the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, and that involves going out to a milkweed patch once a week to count monarchs that are out there. You've heard me mention Journey North, and that one's probably the simplest one to get involved with. It's just reporting your sightings of monarchs to the program, and that can be monarch eggs, monarch larvae. It can be roosts of monarchs in the fall, but most people in the spring report the first adult that they see. Project Monarch Health is another fun one. This is testing monarchs for a parasite called Ophriocystis electrospira. We just call it OE for short, but that one's based out of the University of Georgia, and they will send you a free testing kit if you email them. And they have videos on how to get involved there and how to participate in the program on their website. And then the one that I think a lot of people are familiar with is Monarch Watch, based out of the University of Kansas. They are the ones that run the tagging program for the Eastern US. You can order tags from Monarch Watch, and then they'll send them to you in August, and you can tag butterflies to help track the migration. And then finally, once you've learned more, once you've planted, once you've participated in a monitoring program or any combination of those, you can share what you know with other people. So because monarchs cross borders, they have a complicated life cycle, they switch niches, they're a prairie butterfly in the summer, they overwinter in Mexico in a forest. Monarch conservation can be very complicated. So we absolutely need anyone and everyone available to be planting habitat for monarch butterflies and other pollinators. There was a paper released a couple of years ago called the All Hands on Deck paper that you can look up if you want to. And this is where the Monarch Conservation Science Partnership that MJV is a part of, gets this, all hands on deck lingo from. But that paper was used to set our targets. It's informing our priorities, and we know that we won't get to the population goals that we need, which is the 6 hectares of monarchs taking up space in Mexico and 500,000 butterflies in the Western US. We will not get there without everyone participating. So do what you can, every little bit helps. We can all work together to protect monarchs and other organisms, and just know that you're not alone. We're all in this together. We're all helping pollinators. We all want the same thing for pollinators. We want them to thrive. We want them to have the habitat they need so that we can have a healthy ecosystem to live in for ourselves as well. With that, I want to remind you, put your questions in the chat box. We'll take them at the end. And then I think I'll turn it back to Lori to switch us to our next presenter. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Katie-Lyn. That was awesome. So we have 2 speakers today. Our next speaker is Lauren Haydon-Dries. She's a senior water resource educator with Washington Conservation District, and she'll be helping us understand what we can do to conserve our water and specifically groundwater conservation. So Lauren, you feel ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, you want to launch your screen?
Oh, correct, yes. 1 minute. Alrighty, hopefully everyone can see that.
That looks great.
Alrighty, and I'll get started. So like Lori said, my name is Lauren Haydon-Dries, and today my Earth chapter is going to be on water conservation, and again, more specifically groundwater, and I am a water resources educator at the Washington Conservation District. The Washington Conservation District is a local unit of government in Washington County. We've been around since the 40s. We're a traditional soil and water conservation district. We just dropped the soil and water part. So some of the projects we're involved with in are water monitoring. We do natural resource inventories, such as habitat management plans. We do a whole array of conservation projects, both urban and rural. So anywhere from your small pocket planting or rain garden to a grassed waterway. And then another big part is education, which is where I come in. So I get to do these workshops and different family events throughout the year. And today it happens to be online. So glad you guys joined us. So today I'm going to be starting with an introduction to groundwater. What is it? What is the current state of water or groundwater more locally? And then how you guys can help protect groundwater both in quality and quantity. And then again, questions at the end, please. So what is groundwater? Oh, so I should say that I normally talk to groundwater with fourth graders, so I'm trying to bring it up a level for you all. So this diagram here is showing how the ground is saturated below the water table here. The ground above the water table may be wet to a certain degree, but it does not stay saturated. The dirt and the rock in this unsaturated zone still contains some air and water and are able to support vegetation growth. The saturated water or the saturated zone below the water table is where we find our aquifers. And this is where water is filling those tiny spaces or pores between rock particles and sand. And this water moves very, very slowly, but it does move. It is not stationary. And eventually it discharges into streams, lakes, and oceans. And also regarding the age of groundwater, depending on how far you go down and the type of substrate, this could be anywhere from days to thousands of years old. So these are really, really important resources to protect. Some of them are aquifers very deep underground that we have not accessed. And the goal is that if we are responsibly managing these near surface aquifers that we normally tap into, we won't need to go any further and contaminate some of our older aquifers. So there's a kind of a lot of layers in groundwater management, especially in Minnesota, that I just wanted to touch on because it gets a little complicated and everyone kind of has a different role. So starting on the left with the DNR, they're the only agency in the state that's really focused on groundwater quality. Our county, our water monitoring staff here goes out quarterly and monitors about 45 wells and just looks at the elevation. Occasionally they take samples, but it's mostly looking at the elevation. And these are observation wells. These aren't drinking water wells. Moving over to the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, they're focused on agricultural pesticides and fertilizer contamination. I should note that in Washington County, we do have some elevated levels of nitrates, specifically in Denmark and Cottage Grove. So there are some people in our office who are on a task force working with those landowners to implement some best practices. Moving over to the MPCA, they're very narrowed and focused in on industrial contamination. And lastly, the Minnesota Department of Health is focused on our drinking water supply. Our staff also collects some samples quarterly for those. Again, mostly just observation wells and before the water has been treated. So our office is not involved at all with drinking water supply or management, but we do collaborate with these partners in the field. So the answer to who depends on groundwater, likely you. 75% of landowners in the state of Minnesota depend on groundwater for their drinking water source, and 90% of our agricultural irrigation is from groundwater. Locally in Washington County, groundwater supports 100% of our drinking water, as well as irrigation and commercial uses. And approximately 20% of our landowners have private wells. So that's just to say that a lot of people think that just because it comes from the city, it might come from the Mississippi or St. Croix, but it's actually just being pumped from a large municipal well. So groundwater availability in Minnesota. If you look down right here, this where my cursor is, this is Washington County. That's just where my lens is going to be focused today, but this still applies to the whole metro area. We have a lot of groundwater available to us in multiple aquifers. In the metro province, we have very thick, often greater than 100 feet of sandy and clay glacial drift overlying sandstone, limestone, and dolostone aquifers. And because of these unique characteristics that were caused by glaciers moving through the area millions of years ago, we have very plentiful aquifers. Unfortunately, despite these plentiful resources, we have still put a lot of pressure on our aquifers here in the metro area. This graph here shows how our water use has shifted from 1940s to 2010. And you can see that originally over 80% of our use was from surface water in the Twin Cities. And now about 70% is from groundwater. So we have really shifted our supply. Most of that water comes from the Prairie du Chien aquifer, and it has continued to steadily decline as the metro area continues to become more populated. So sources of groundwater contamination kind of varies on the land use. In agricultural areas, it tends to be nitrates and fertilizers. There's also often groundwater close to the surface table, and so it's easier to contaminate. In rural areas, we're often looking at E. coli from failing septic systems. I'll touch on that later. And then these very dense urban areas, we're really concerned about chlorides from road salt. And it should mention as well that this kind of pairs with overconsumption as well, because when we overuse our groundwater, it actually draws the contaminated water closer to the surface. That's a problem for our drinking water and for our local streams and rivers as well that are sourced from groundwater. I didn't want to go into too much for Washington County just because there's a lot of new information coming out all the time about our different plumes, and I'm not an expert on the matter, nor do I want to be. I would recommend directing all questions to Washington County Department of Health, but we do have a history of groundwater contamination here in the county. This is part due to our unique geology. We have a lot of karst, which means water moves very quickly from the surface to our aquifers, bringing contaminants with it. And we've also had some poor landfilling practices. So there are 4 special well and bore and construction areas in our county, 2 trichloroethylene plumes and 2 other VOC plumes. And you guys have probably all heard about the PFC contamination in the southern part of the county as well. And as I mentioned, there's some nitrate pollution hotspots in Cottage Grove and Denmark Township where it's mostly row crops. The effects on groundwater quantity, I like to use the analogy with students that our aquifers are like a bank account. We need to make sure that we are allowing our aquifers to replenish in time. If we're causing too many withdrawals, which can be caused by this higher population, putting a lot of stress on our aquifers, and then irresponsible practices like overwatering our lawns, we're not allowing our aquifers to have enough time to replenish. This is actually the time of year where our aquifers are really getting the chance to replenish through the snow melt. It's nice and slow, and the temperatures are going up slowly. Often in the summer, there's too much evaporation happening for our aquifers to replenish. So even though there's a bunch of rain, a lot of that never gets to our aquifers. So another thing that's impacting our ability to deposit is that we have a lot of impervious surfaces in the Twin Cities, and obviously water cannot infiltrate through those. So really anywhere where we can protect our natural areas, especially wetlands, those are great ways to protect both water quality and the quantity that our aquifers. And obviously this affects the sustainability of our lakes and streams too. There's a lot of plant life and animals that depend on that water. So this does make a difference, and we have seen a lot of effects on lake levels and streams in Washington County, particularly some of our trout streams. So we are seeing these effects right now. And now I'm going to focus on to the more fun part, which is how you guys can help protect groundwater. And I'm going to be touching on both quality and quantity in this part. So number 1, we're going to focus on using water wisely inside. I think most of you guys are familiar with things like turning off the water when you're brushing your teeth and taking shorter showers, but as homeowners, there's a lot we can do as well in regards to appliances. We can make sure that we're testing and fixing leaky toilets. Toilets make up about 20% of our indoor water use, which is pretty significant. So this is a really big area to test. And if you have young kids, this can kind of be a fun project. You can take off the lid of your toilet tank, put some dye in the back, and wait 15 minutes. And if it shows up in your bowl, it means that you have a leak and probably need to replace the flapper. Another big thing is to install your low flow shower heads. You're going to be looking for, if it's an EPA WaterSense shower head, it's going to have to be 2 gallons per minute, but some of them are in that 2.5 range. It just won't be WaterSense certified. And then faucet aerators are a really easy way to save water throughout the year by upgrading all the faucets in the house to about 1.5 or even less. I would say for simple faucets that are just used for hand washing, you can go to a half gallon per minute, can save anywhere from 700 to 1,000 gallons a year for an average family. Also, when it's time to replace our old appliances, we hope that you guys will consider choosing some more efficient models. Again, looking for that EPA WaterSense certification. Lori's going to provide the link at the end, but if you go to the EPA WaterSense page, it goes, it breaks down by all the different appliances and the different qualifications that they need to meet, and it can be really helpful. I should also note that a lot of the cities and local government units offer rebates for upgrading some of these appliances, so it's worth checking in and doing a little research to see if those are available. So one of the biggest ones I would say would be focusing on using water wisely outside. So it's estimated that about 9 billion gallons of water are used each day, mostly for landscape irrigation. And experts estimate that as much as 50% of this water is wasted due to overwatering caused by inefficiencies in our irrigation methods and systems. So one way that we can help minimize that huge pressure on our aquifers is to just aim first for irrigating not at all, or just aiming for that 1 inch per week. If you are not sure if your irrigation system is achieving that, you can do a catch can test by putting out something like a cat food can or a tuna can and putting it out while you're running your system. And if it's overflowing during your runtime, you have gotten more than 1 inch per week. An easier way to do this is to consider investing in a smart controller with either a rain or soil sensor. If possible, I would recommend a soil sensor. That's going to give you even more efficiencies. And basically, think of this as a thermostat for the outside. These sensors are looking at the different variables outside and determining if now is a good time to water or not. And this way, it's not something you have to actively be thinking about. You can kind of just set it and forget it, but it is important that in addition to a smart controller, you need to make sure that you have functional spray nozzles as well, because if those aren't functioning well, you're still having problems with inefficiency. So I suggest that every year when you're starting to reboot your irrigation systems, you go outside and kind of do a simple audit. This is something you can also ask a local landscaping company to help you with as well. And basically you're gonna want to look at all your heads and make sure, one, are they completely uncovered and out of the ground? Are some of them facing a fence or maybe a wall in your house or not even spraying an important area? And then watch when they're spraying as well. If they're misting, it means that you have too high of water pressure. And so you can easily replace those spray or rotor nozzles for about $10 with something called a pressure regulated head. And it makes sure that you're using the right pressure and therefore not wasting any water. Another easy way to save water is by taking better care of our lawns, because a healthy lawn needs less water. It's something that I encourage people to do is to mow high, aim for at least 3 to 4 inches. And once you've gotten your grass up to that height, you're going to want to mow often because you won't be stressing it out as much by waiting a long time and cutting off more than a third at a time. We also like to say that the grass height often reflects the root depth as well. So if you're constantly mowing your lawn to 1 inch or 1.5 inches, your root system is always very shallow as well, and therefore is not going to have deep roots to be able to access water, and it's going to be very thirsty. Lastly, I would suggest exploring getting a rain barrel for your garden for irrigation purposes. Washington County does offer a discounted rain barrel for about, I believe, $59. I have the link that will be at the end as well. They also sell compost bins, and these are things that are pretty easy to install. And since many cities are starting to enforce watering bans, rainwater can be applied at any time, and it's naturally soft and devoid of minerals, chlorine, fluoride, and these other chemicals, which means it's often better for our plants and our lawns. It's important to notice that rainwater cannot be used for drinking without special treatment. This is just a picture of some of the, I believe the one on the right is the rain barrel that we give out. It's missing the little screen at the top that we normally have to filter out leaves and such like that. There's all different models, but basically it's catching water from your downspout and holding it, and then there's a nozzle at the bottom, and it's just a gravity fed system. And if you want to make it a little prettier, you can add in some rain chains throughout your yard. This can help guide water down in a nice way as well. So number 3, a big one that also relates back to what Katie was talking about, is going native and planting our native plants here, because one, they're drought tolerant, And so that means that they're not going to need to be irrigated. They have very deep root systems that are going to help improve our soil infiltration, improving the likeliness that our aquifers will be able to be recharged. And then there's those double benefits of just creating habitat for pollinators and birds and other creatures. You probably have maybe heard about bee lawns or no-mow or low-mow. This is a blend of a fine fescue grass that is very drought tolerant and more suited for Minnesota climates. So this is something to explore too. Lori has a really excellent handout on how to convert your lawn to a bee lawn and use a fine fescue species. And this is just a beautiful example of a native planting with some prairie comb flowers and bee balm. And I thought we could all just use a little bit of flowers right now to cheer us up. And there's also a lot of people think that if your yard is shady, there isn't options. If you're interested in a good shady mix as well, that's something that the Conservation District can help come up with through a site visit. So we're going to talk about those resources later. So number 4, these next 2 ones are going to relate mostly to people who have private wells and septic systems, but these are a huge source of contamination, so it's important to touch on. So if you're a private well owner, you are responsible for testing your own water, and you should do this regularly. This little picture right here is what the Minnesota Department of Health recommends for testing coliform bacteria, nitrates, arsenic, lead, and manganese. A lot of times they can kind of do a nice bundle and do it for pretty cheap. I know Washington County can do it for about, I want to say $45. I'll have to check again, but we'll have a link for water testing on their website. I will note that if you're interested in getting your water tested for PFCs, they're not doing that right now, and you'd have to check with the Minnesota Department of Health. During flooding, wells can become an easy source of contamination, so there are a lot of great guidelines for how to protect your wells during flooding, mainly making sure that they're sealed and protected. Inside your house where your wells come up, you're going to want to put down some heavy plastic and things that will prevent it from backing up. Basically, during this flooding, that's a great way for E. coli to get into your well. And if you think of the well as a great way to access to our aquifers, it can contaminate your neighbor's drinking water as well. Lastly, you're going to want to seal unused wells. There are actually some laws around this in Minnesota. Wells that are not being used for consumption or any irrigation purposes are considered abandoned. And an abandoned well can be a potential threat to health, safety, and the environment by contaminating groundwater, which, as you know, provides 100% of drinking water in Washington County. And well sealing is basically the process of clearing an unused well of the debris and then filling it with grout. And this has to be completed by a licensed well contractor. So you can find that as well at your county's website. There's also funding available to do this, especially if you are located in a drinking water management area. There's up to 100% cost share. Otherwise, for anywhere else in the county, it's 50% cost share. Lastly, we're going to focus on septic systems. So a failing septic system can be a huge source of E. coli contamination, as well as a lot of nutrients that can cause algae growth and stuff in our local lakes and rivers. So when you're installing a new tank or treatment area or doing any repairs and modifications, a septic permit is required, and you need to get that through your county. If you're moving and transferring property, you must have a compliance inspection, again, by a licensed inspector in Washington County. And in order to incentivize people to upgrade failing systems, can be very expensive, has a series of low-interest loan programs for complete replacements or just upgrades for any non-compliant septic systems. This does not apply to installing brand new ones. So I mentioned local assistance. Again, Washington County offers free site visits to everyone in the county. If you're not in Washington County, I don't want you to think that you are out of luck. You'll just have to check in with your local county. I know Ramsey County does site visits, as well as Dakota and Chisago. There are also different grants that are available, and a great way to work with your soil water conservation district. We're aware of the grants that are happening at the state level, the federal level, and the local level, so we can help match you with those resources. If you want to install a pollinator garden or something like that, we can work with you.
Thank you for joining us for today's Earth Chapter. Thanks to Pollinator Friendly Alliance, our host, and Ramsey County Soil and Water, our co-host. If you have questions or inquiries, please contact pollinatorfriendly.org.